On today's edition of Locked On NHL, we continue our season previews, making our way division by division. Today, we tackle the muddled and chaotic Atlantic Division.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. I am Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the hosts of Locked On Penguins. We want to thank everyone who's making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Gametime, where if you download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code Locked On NHL, you'll get $20 off your first purchase. So, today's episode, we are deliberating over the very, very chaotic Atlantic Division, which, as Hunter said before we started recording, all 8 of these teams could realistically be playoff teams. I think we know who the upper crust in this group is, but that middle of the pack is going to make for really interesting conversation, and we don't have a ton of time. So, Hunter, I throw it over to you first. Give me number 8, and let's start making our way through.
Yeah, I will say this is definitely the hardest division to predict of the 4. So far, and I will say there's the potential that I could look really foolish with a lot of this division, just because someone has to finish last. A few more of these teams have to miss the playoffs, and you're right. All 8 of these teams have a realistic shot to make it, which is why this is just so hard. But number 8 for me, and I know I'm probably going to get flack for this, I have the Buffalo Sabres at number 8. I got to see it first. They brought back Lindy Ruff to coach the team. I'm not really a big believer in him. I want to see if he's able to prove me wrong with that. Don't get me wrong. This Sabres team has talent. Tage Thompson is really awesome. Alex Tuch is great. Dylan Cousins. You have Zach Benson for another full season. I like Jason Zucker in a third-line role. Defensively, you have 2 absolute studs in Dahlin and Power, two number 1 defensemen, to be honest. And then you have Bowen Byram. But the main thing for me also with Buffalo, Nick, it's the goaltending. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen and Devin Levi, it doesn't give me as much confidence as some of the other tandems in this division do. Again, Lindy Ruff, I'm not sold on him either. I think if this season does go south for the Sabres, you're going to see a lot of changes up there. Maybe, the GM gets canned. Maybe some of the players get traded, but I think this is a make it or break it year for the Sabres. I'm not convinced that it's going to be the big year for them. I would love to be proven wrong, considering that I picked them to make the playoffs last year. But at this point, I got to see it with them.
Hey, man, I was going to save are the Sabres going to break their drought question for later, but you answered that question very early on in the episode. Number 8 for me, I have Montreal. I'm a big proponent of what Montreal is doing. They are rebuilding in a responsible and thorough manner. They are getting their books in order so that a year or 2 from now, when they have maximum financial flexibility, they'll be able to be in play for marquee players across anything, whether it's a free agent or a trade. They have slowly but surely overhauled their entire organization. I really like the way Marty St. Louis coaches their younger guys, where he gives them room for opportunity to make mistakes, to grow, and not feel like every game is life or death, where it's more of a, we all know this is going to be a multi-year process, and until we're ready to break through, it's okay if we have growing pains. And I really admire a coach who's willing to be honest like that, because so much of the interaction we get from coaches with the media is performative nonsense. It's, well, we're trying to win every game, even if you're the Sharks, even if you know you're only going to win 25 games, you come out and say, well, our goal is to win the Stanley Cup this year, even though we know that's not true. Marty St. Louis is honest about it, and I really commend the way Montreal's gone about their rebuild. I like their young pieces. I think we'll see a lot of their young defensemen in the course of the next 12 months, whether it's Reinbacher, whether it's Melu, whether it's Lane Hudson. They have spent a lot of assets over the last 3 seasons to overhaul their defense. And if it all lines up, we're going to be talking about maybe the best defensive unit in the entire league 2 or 3 years from now, once those guys all mature. They do have to figure out goaltending. I think Montembeault is fine as a starter, but I don't think he's a long-term franchise goalie. I think he's firmly middle class. They've got a few nice pieces up front in Suzuki and Slavkovsky. I like what they're trying to do, but it will take time. Back to you for number 7.
Right. I have Montreal a little bit higher up on the list, but I still don't have them as a playoff team for this year, just as a small tease. Number 7 for me, again, I'm sure the fine folks up here are going to give me flack for this as well. I have Ottawa at number 7, Kind of like Buffalo, I kind of got to see it with them. This is a team that also has quite a bit of talent. That top line of Tkachuk, Stützle, and Giroux, one of the more underrated top lines in the league. They have Shane Pinto for a full season. I really like getting David Perron for a full year as well. This forward group, it's better than I feel like quite a few other forward groups in the league. Defensively, you have Sanderson, who I think is turning into a dude. Shabbat is awesome. Outside of that, though, I feel like there's more room for improvement along that blue line, at least in my opinion. And then goaltending-wise, they have to hope that Linus Ullmark, this will finally be the goalie that really solves their issues. It feels like the Ottawa Senators have not really had stable goaltending for the last, 6 to 7 years at this point, to be honest. But still, they're hit with the injury bug every year. That always complicates things. But it feels like this is a team that's still, and I hate putting it like this, but I feel like they're still learning how to win. I feel like this is still a very young core. I like the direction that they're going in. I'm just not sure they're going to be able to break into the dance this year. I could be dead wrong on that. They're going to have a shot, but I still need to see more from this young core first.
Travis Green's an interesting hire for them, coming off of how things ended for him in Vancouver, where it got about as bad as it possibly could, where they were almost, I want to say, second to last in the entire league in December. I think that was 2.5 years ago now, and they brought in Bruce Boudreau, and then the next year they did it with Tocchet, same exact type of deal. I like a lot of the pieces on Ottawa. I have them a smidge higher as well. Number 7 for me, I have the Detroit Red Wings. They have 7 goalies in training camp. None of them are particularly confidence-inspiring. Whether you want to talk about Talbot or Ville Husso, none of those guys are particularly enticing at this point. Their defense outside of Mo Seider is bad. Just outright objectively, it's bad. Their forward group is decent. They have a little bit of depth. It is all offense. None of their forwards are going to be mistaken for Alex Barkov. They don't really have. I think the path for the playoffs through Detroit is just, they're going to need to score too much. And at a certain point, you need to play a little bit of defense. You need to have a goalie, and Detroit doesn't have either of those. We saw this last year, and all they did was add Vladimir Tarasenko, and they signed Cam Talbot as their goalie. I think Detroit will be fun. I think all of their games are going to be very high scoring, back and forth, chaotic. I like what I've seen so far from Lucas Raymond. I like the idea, what they tried to do in bringing in DeBrincat. Kane will still score some goals. He'll put up some assists. Tarasenko, same deal. But this team's not that good. For a team that has been in a rebuild for as long as they have, you would like to have seen more by now, and they just haven't given you a whole lot. And I struggle to see a world where they're going to outplay a lot of this middle class in this division, whether it's Ottawa, whether it's Buffalo, whether it's Montreal. I struggle to envision a world where Detroit can be better than those teams.
I think those are all fair points. I have Detroit coming up in just a little bit, but number 6 on my list, this is where I do have the Montreal Canadiens. I really like what Kent Hughes is doing with this team. He's been doing a great job with this rebuild. And, you're getting players like Patrick Laine, just someone who's a buy low candidate, but I think is primed for a potential bounce back year overall, especially if he gets top 6 minutes, which I do think he's going to get. I really liked that move. I think Slavkovsky is turning into finally a top 6 player. He was outstanding last year for the Canadiens. Nick Suzuki, another great player. He had a hell of a year last year. Cole Caulfield, one of the more underrated goal scorers in this league. I actually really like a lot of this forward group, especially their top 6. Dvorak, I think, is, fine enough, at least on the 3rd line. Jake Evans on your 4th line. Armia is a good penalty killer, can also chip in on the score sheet at times. Gallagher, while he's not what he used to be, I still feel like for someone who can be a leader in that locker room and can chip in when needed, I still feel like he's a good presence to have on that team. Mike Matheson was awesome last year. It didn't matter if it was 5-on-5 or on the power play. He has really blossomed even more since leaving Pittsburgh. And you also have Lane Hudson, who is turning into a dude before our very eyes. He is going to be awesome for a very long time. I am very high on him. Gooley, I'm also pretty high on as well. I like Montembeault. I think he can give the Canadiens above average goaltending, at least a little bit. Caden Primo, I think he's okay, but I think Montembeault is definitely the better of the two goalies. I don't think the Canadiens are going to make the playoffs this year, but I do think their time is coming in the next year or two where they eventually get in the race. I really like what Hughes is doing. I like the coaching job of Marty St. Louis. That's a team that's very much going in the right direction for me.
Next up for me, I have Buffalo here. I could see a world where Buffalo plays as well as being fourth in this entire division.
Yeah.
I really like their goalie tandem as a concept, to joke of a concept of a plan, but you got two good goalies there. Pekka Luukkonen and Devin Levy have good amateur or developmental league results. If you have two tandem goalies who will both profile as starters down the road, there's a little bit lighter workload for both. It presents more opportunity. You mentioned the tandem of Power and Dahlin, who are both outstanding. You also have Bo and Byram in that mix as well. You have Dylan Cousins. The forward group is oozing with potential. The biggest red flag I have for Buffalo and why I ultimately have Ottawa ahead of them is Lindy Ruff's a terrible hockey coach.
Yeah.
I objectively, I remember, and this will be the last point before we take our first break, 2 years ago when they bounced the Rangers in the first round, a lot of the Devils people I talked to said that it was by accident, that Lindy Ruff really wasn't doing anything remarkable, that he got the perfect injury luck year, he had the hot goalie, and that got him through. But I think the way you watch how Lindy Ruff still conducts himself and still acts like
he's the main reason why I have them last. I just don't think he's that good of a coach at all.
I'll be very curious to see the interaction between him and the defense, because the teams he's coached defensively, whether it was the Rangers as a David Quinn assistant or the Devils, the teams are just bad defensively. So I'll be very curious to see how Dahlin and Power do in that environment. We are going to take our first break of today's show before we keep making our way through the Atlantic Division. So be sure to stick around. If you're like me, you like going out and getting to events. Last night, I was at AEW Grand Slam at Arthur Ashe. I got my friends and I tickets through the only app I buy tickets from, our friends over at Gametime, with some of the best features in the ticket buying experience. Things like the panoramic seat view, which is my personal favorite. If you're going to an event, you want to get an idea of the view. If you're going to a playoff baseball game, you want to be able to see balls and strikes. You want to be able to yell at the umpire and ask him what he's seeing. Was that high? Was that low? And you can do that with the panoramic seat view in the app before you buy. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime, will credit you 110% of the difference. And Gametime ticket coverage, where your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing business. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. Today's episode is also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where you can start the NFL season with a big return on America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. If you're like me, you are so happy football's back. Week 4 kicks off tonight. The Dallas Cowboys on a rainy Thursday night at MetLife Stadium taking on Daniel Jones and the Giants. The Giants laying 5.5 points as home underdogs. My favorite game of the weekend, though, the Eagles going down to Tampa Bay to take on the reeling Baker Mayfield and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Buccaneers are laying 1.5 points as home underdogs. If you want to get in on the action, go visit FanDuel.com to get started. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this edition of Locked On NHL, where we're continuing to make our way through the Atlantic Division. I just recapped why I think the Sabres are going to end up finishing 6th. Tell me who's next for you, Hunter.
So number 5 for me, Nick, they're going to kind of finish similar to where they did last year. And that's, for me, at least, my prediction is the Detroit Red Wings at number 5. I have them a bit higher, at least on my list, just because of that forward group. I think, again, it's one of the better forward groups in the league. It's going to be all gas, no brakes for that unit. All offense, maybe a little bit of defense, but it's mainly going to be all offense overall. DeBrincat, Larkin, Raymond, that's one heck of a top line. I am all in on Lucas Raymond, by the way. Last year, I felt like was his big breakout year in the NHL, where I think a lot more people were noticing just how good of a player he is. Obviously got his big payday. You're going to see it again this year. This guy is going to be a very good player for a long time. He was taking over games almost nightly down the stretch. He was the biggest reason I felt like why the Red Wings were in the playoff race down the stretch. It was just because he was elevating his game to such a high level. And I expect that to continue this year. I'm all in on Raymond. You have adding Tarasenko through free agency, I feel like is a smart bet. He can give you, around 20, 25 goals, maybe even more than that. Patrick Kane, he'll still score at least a little bit more for you, even though he's up there in age. You have Andrew Kopp on the third line, which I think is pretty decent. Michael Rasmussen, Christian Fischer. Overall, I think it's a good forward group. Defensively, you kind of hit the nail on your head, Nick. When you have Ben Sherratt potentially getting top pairing minutes next to Mo Seider, your defensive group is not that good, to say the least. And I'm not trying to be mean to Ben Sherratt, but he should not be getting top pairing minutes on a team that is trying to make the playoffs. Mo Seider, we all know he's great. Jeff Petrie, I felt like he was decent last year. He has the potential to maybe up his game a little bit more this year. But, other than that, there's just really not too much here on the back end that inspires that much confidence outside of Seider and maybe a little bit of Petrie. And then goaltending wise, you said it. It's, Alex Lyon, Cam Talbot, et cetera, et cetera. We got to see. I think, again, they're very much going to be in the race. I have them missing as of this time. And if they do miss, I actually have a question for you. Do you think that is the end of Steve Yzerman in Detroit?
This is why I always tell people never hire your franchise legends. It's the reason I don't want the Rangers to hire Mark Messier, Brian Leetch, Henrik Lundqvist. Never hire a team legend, because then you have to fire that team legend if they don't do a good job.
Yeah.
It's going to be a hard sell to convince people, we got to fire the best or second best player in the history of our franchise. I honestly would have moved on from Steve Yzerman after this past season, because of the lack of plan. They have not done a lot of long-term planning. All of their moves have been very short-term and very interim term. So I'm going to flash the graphic here for those watching on YouTube to see how the rest of the Locked On NHL hosts voted. But that middle class, Ottawa, Buffalo, and Detroit, you could put them in any order, and I would believe you. The host voted Montreal 8, Ottawa 7, Buffalo 6, Detroit 5. Out of the polling we did over the course of the last week. And I think that's reasonable. I think any permutation of those three teams could go in any order. They were all reasonably close this past season, in all honesty. And
all four of those teams from the 5 through 8, I really think can go in any order. Nothing would surprise me at all with that.
I agree. Next up for me, I have Ottawa. I just like their high-end talent the most of them, Buffalo and Detroit. That was the ultimate argument for me. You mentioned Jake Sanderson, who's blossoming into what looks to be a genuine elite first-pair left-handed D. You still have Thomas Chabot up there. You have Stützle, who's probably the best player from the 2020 draft class in there. You've still got Brady Tkachuk, who's very good. Claude Giroux set a career high in goals at 33 years old last year, who's somebody to keep an eye on. And you finally addressed it. And this is ultimately what it comes down to. If Linus Ullmark doesn't work, then you need to consider moving arenas. You need to consider rebranding the team, because nobody's fixing that goalie room if Linus Ullmark can't come in there and just be average. He doesn't need to be great. If Montreal has average goaltending last year, they're probably a playoff team. If they get 905 save goalie last year, they're probably pretty close to being, if not outright being, a playoff team. To you, sir, squeeze in 4 before the break.
Well, I think you meant Ottawa being a playoff team, not Montreal last year.
That's what I meant, yeah.
Just playing around with you a little bit there, Nick, but I hear you. Number 4 for me, that is the Tampa Bay Lightning. I have the Lightning making the playoffs again this year. They can really form a quote-unquote super line, if you will, if they want to, with Gensel, Point, Kucherov. Their forward depth after that, it's definitely not nearly as strong as it has been in prior years. Obviously, with Stamkos going to Nashville, that takes a big hit, but you have a second line with Brandon Hagel, who can chip in on a nightly basis. Sorelli, especially a really good player in his own zone. Connor Sherry is a good depth piece. Got Nick Paul, Cam Atkinson, who I think when healthy, I think Atkinson can definitely give you, 15 to 20 plus goals, especially on a third line role. Fourth line, not much to write home about. Defensively, you still have Victor Hedman, one of the best defensemen in the league. You got Ryan McDonough. They brought him back. I understand why, but, trading Sergachev, Nick, man, that leaves a big hole in that blue line. And just the rest of that blue line, it doesn't inspire that much confidence, at least for me. I mean, Chernak is fine as a number 3, number 4, but it's really just kind of Hedman, McDonough, who's still fine, Chernak, and again, not really too much else down there. Obviously, you have Andrei Vasilevsky, who is a top 5 goaltender in the league still. He is one of the biggest reasons why I still have Tampa Bay making the playoffs outside of that super top line if they want to do that. Also, of course, Sean Cooper, one of the best coaches in the league. I don't think those factors are going to allow Tampa Bay to miss the playoffs this year. I think the days of them being, a bona fide contender might be over. I hesitate to say that just because, it wasn't long ago when they won the back-to-back cups, but I feel like they're, again, good enough to get in the playoffs, but I'm not sure they're going to do as much damage as they used to.
I agree with you there. We are going to take our final break of today's show. We'll come back. I'll give you the top 4. Hunter will give you his top 3 right after this quick break. We are all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work, use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster, 93% of employers agree. Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Indeed leverages over 140 million unique qualifications and preferences every single day, which means its matching engine is constantly learning and getting better. So the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. Real quick, I'll give you number 4 for me as well. I have Tampa Bay in that spot for pretty much all of the same reasons Hunter said. Their high-end talent is good enough that on any given night, they can beat any given team in the NHL. And my hope and my educated guess is that the further removed from back surgery Andrei Vasilevsky is, the better he's going to play. My assumption is that the further they get into the season, the better he's going to play. And for the most part, their top 6 and their first defensive pair in Vasilevsky, that's enough most nights. Against the vast majority of teams in the league, they'll be able to get by. They should be a wild card or the third team in this division. I feel reasonably confident about that. I'll be curious to see if they do a super line or if they try and split up Point, Kucherov, and Gensel to try and distribute some scoring throughout their forward group. But if they want to run all 3 of those guys together and just say we're going to own those minutes, they very well could get away with doing that as well. My big question is just how good Vasilevsky can be, because last year, again, you have the caveat of coming off a major surgery, didn't start the season until December, no training camp, no preseason, no ramp up, just physical therapy and right into the fire. So if Vasilevsky's good to go and he can be a 9-10, 9-15 goalie, Tampa Bay's fine. Tampa Bay's a playoff team. And then it depends who they play in the first round. And we'll start talking about the teams they might play in the first round now as I throw it to Hunter.
Yeah, so number 3 on my list, I have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Bona fide playoff team, bona fide Stanley Cup contender overall. You still have the core 4 there. We have to see what happens with Mitch Marner. I'm not really sure how they're really going to approach this contract discussion during the season, if he's going to walk after the year, all that stuff. It just seems like a kind of a little bit of a mess overall with that, but that's just my opinion overall. You have Craig Berube as the new head coach. There's really no more excuses. I mean, there really hasn't been excuses for the last couple of years now, to be honest, but now you have a Stanley Cup champion as your head coach. Berube, I think, is one of the better coaches in the league. If he can't get more out of this core group, especially this year, I really don't know what coach is going to get more out of, this core group. Again, Matthews is fantastic, one of the 3 best players in the sport. Mitch Marner is awesome. William Nylander is great. John Tavares, while still being a little bit older, he's still very good. Max Domi had a really good year for Toronto last year. If he's able to up his goal scoring a little bit more, that's going to be even bigger for them. Defensively, obviously, Morgan Riley, one of the best defensemen on the planet. You have him potentially paired with Chris Tanev, who I know is a little bit older, but Tanev is still very good in his own zone. Don't get that twisted. He is still a great defensive defenseman in this league, loves to block shots, really physical along the boards. I think that's a good partner for Riley, at least in my opinion. You have Ekman Larson. I understand taking, the bet with him there, especially after how he played in Florida. I think if you give him second or third pairing minutes, that should be fine. The biggest question mark for me, though, Joseph Woll. Very good when healthy. He's got to stay healthy. He's had some injury problems a little bit. If he's able to stay healthy, he'll give them above average goaltending. This team will be, again, totally fine during the regular season. We all know what the big question is with the Leafs. Will they get it done in the playoffs? And if my standing predictions, come true, they're going to have to slay the dragon, or try to, at least this year.
I'm very worried about Toronto, who I have third as well, frankly, because of their goaltending situation. Woll's never started more than 24 games in a season. We have seen this over and over and over again. No matter what team, no matter how good they were in a smaller role, the physical jump in going from 20 to 40, let alone 50 starts, you hit a physical wall really, really quick. You look at what happened to Jack Campbell 3 years ago in Toronto. Jack Campbell had never started more than 25 games in a season, and then he started 50, and he has dealt with chronic injuries ever since that. It is mind-boggling to me that you could go into the season with this high of expectations, knowing that you very well may have to trade Marner in season at the deadline just to avoid losing him for nothing, and your best goalie situation is this. And look, I don't think they're going to trade Marner in season.
They won't trade Marner at the deadline, not when they have all this on the line, and I definitely know there'll be a player.
Oh, no, I don't think they'll... I think they either get a contract done or they trade him at the deadline. There is zero chance Toronto walks him to free agency without losing him for nothing. That's the thing. If you're Brad Treliving, it would be such a dereliction of duty and such negligence to let probably your second or third best player, depending if you prefer him or Nylander, leave for nothing. And look, I think Toronto will be fine in the regular season, and ultimately it'll come down to who they play in the first round. We both have the Bruins second. I think the Bruins aren't as good as they have been in the last few seasons, but I think their coaching and their commitment to good team defense will make them competitive, even if they aren't as good. Like, Lindholm's not scaring anyone as a 1C, but you put him with Pasta, they'll figure it out. They'll be okay.
That's an upgrade over what they had last year, for God's sake.
Yeah, Boston's going to be good this year. Boston, again, like a lot of these teams, Boston, Toronto, I think you can make an argument, Tampa Bay, they're all going to be good regular season teams. For them, it really will come down to what the path is in the playoffs if you want to make an argument for them as a serious contender. All of these teams have major flaws. That's not a secret. Boston doesn't have enough scoring. Toronto doesn't have goaltending. Tampa Bay has no depth. These are all major flaws, but we all think they're going to be playoff teams.
Right. No, I 100% agree with you on that. And yeah, with Toronto, I mean, even if Marner isn't signed by the deadline, but they're still very much in the race, just what message also does that send to your fan base if you trade him at that point when you know you're going to make the playoffs? It just feels like you're kind of, I don't know, handicapping yourselves. I don't get me wrong. I understand the argument you're making. I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate because it's like, what message are you sending to your fans considering?
Well, you're not going to trade Marner for futures. You're going to do a hockey trade. You're going to trade him for another player who's got term.
That would be the hope. I just don't know if you're going to find that type of player.
You're going to get Mitch Marner for Shea Theodore and some other stuff, and you're going to like it because Vegas has been very quiet and it's on the table. Talk to me about the Bruins real quick, and then we can both do a spiel about the Panthers, and we can get out of here.
Hey, yeah, that trade, it's funny how realistic that is. But yeah, number 2 for me, the Boston Bruins. I am not going to make the same mistake I made last year. I predicted Boston to miss the playoffs last year. Not going to do that again, considering how dumb they made me look. I like the moves that Boston made during the offseason. Lindholm, you're right. He doesn't scare anyone as a first-line center, but for God's sake, he's an upgrade over, someone like, Charlie Coyle. And I like Charlie Coyle, but he's not a number 1 center on the Bruins. Having him as your number 2 center makes a lot more sense. You can put Pasta next to Lindholm, which I think has the makings of a pretty good tandem. Marchand and Coyle together is really strong. I like Trent Frederick as a third liner. Their fourth line, again, it's not too much to write home about, but they still have the big guns up front, which is important. Defensively, you get Zadorov to potentially play with McAvoy. I like that partnership. Zadorov, a good player in his own zone, really lays the boom. I mean, we saw him and just everyone on Edmonton just going at it during their series this past spring. So that's just a total Bruins signing overall. Nikita Zadorov in Boston, it makes too much sense. Obviously, McAvoy is great. I like Lindholm and Carlo. And when Carlo is healthy, I think he's one of the more underrated defensemen.
He's just never healthy. That's the thing. He is never healthy.
He needs to stay healthy for this team because when he is on the ice, he changes that defensive group, I think, quite a bit, in my opinion. And then goaltending, this will be the big year for Swayman, man. We all know what he can do. And
he's got to get a contract first before it can be a big year.
I know. They got to figure that out. That's a big situation. It feels like, just based on all of the reporting from, Freeman and some of the Boston people, that it feels like they're so far apart on money for this long-term contract. And that, I think, is what's holding this up. I think Swayman wants quite a bit more than what the Bruins are wanting to pay him. And it feels like it's kind of at a stalemate right now with about 2 weeks to go until the regular season. You obviously hope that they get this done before the season because, Jonas Korpisalo is the next goalie in line. And, I'll be frank, he's definitely a big step down from, someone like Swayman and then Allmark before that. But assuming this contract gets done before the season, I'm going off that assumption. Swayman, one of the best goaltenders in the league. We've all seen what he can do, and in tandem with Allmark, now we're going to hopefully see, what he can do as a pure number one goaltender, getting 50, 55 starts a season.
Yeah. Number one for me, obviously, the defending Stanley Cup champion Florida Panthers. They've had to overhaul their defense. They've taken some interesting flyers on some guys who may or may not be able to pop off for them. I like the idea of adding Adam Boquist, who was getting some look on their power play the other day at practice as the OEL replacement. Their forward group is as good as anyone's in the entire league. Barkov is the magic eraser. Tkachuk is the most annoying power forward and arguably the best power forward in the entire league. Reinhart will probably go for 40 this year instead of 50. You got Sam Bennett out there lurking as a menace to society. You've still got Anton Lundell, who probably has a little bit of room to grow and still improve as a player. And Florida got through and broke through by having an utmost commitment to team defense and forechecking and cycling. And that stuff is sticky. This is what the Hurricanes would look like if they had 5 of the 20, 30 best players in the entire world. That's what makes Florida so effective. They play that beat you down, wear you down style. They cycle you into oblivion. They force your defensemen into mistakes. You turn the puck over a bunch, and eventually you break down. And yeah, they've had some turnover. All cup winners lose guys. They kept their most important one in Reinhart. I'll be curious to see how long it takes to get their defense going again, losing Montour, losing OEL. But I think they have more than enough talent. I think they'll be competitive. I think the biggest knock on them, if you could find one, is just the fatigue. You go to a cup final 2 years in a row. That's a lot of extra miles on all of those guys. I think they're absolutely a playoff team. I think they're the best team in this division. I wouldn't be surprised if they got to at least the conference finals again. But I think the only real knock on them is the mileage. Other than that, they're going to be really good.
Right. I mean, this is arguably the best team in the Eastern Conference still right now. And you're right. This forward group is tremendous. Arguably the best forward group in the entire league. I mean, Barkov, best two-way center in the league. Matthew Tkachuk, total rat on the ice. I love how he still pisses everyone off, but man, he is so fun to watch. Reinhart, I agree. 40 to 45 goals is probably the sweet spot for him this year. And then Sam Bennett, also another rat as well. Verhaeghe, great in the clutch. I expect that to continue this year. Also, we got to show some love for Evan Rodriguez, baby. He was great in the regular season, great in the playoffs. I expect that to continue this year as well. He's not going to, I guess, quote unquote, wow you with some of the plays he makes, but it's some of the little plays that I think some people don't notice when it comes to his game. He is a very fun player to watch. Anton Lundell, very good third line center. And then defensively, I agree. I'll be curious to see how, replacing Montour goes, but I like some of the flyers they took, Adam Bloquist. I like adding Nate Schmidt as well. I think he's a pretty, still at least a solid puck mover overall, at least in my opinion. You have Ekblad with Forsling, which is going to be a very fun pair to watch again. And then you have Sergei Bobrovsky, who again is one of the best goaltenders on the planet. He has proven that very much these last couple of years. I expect this team to win the division this year. They're a Stanley Cup contender again. I would not be surprised if they not just go to the conference final, Nick, but they go to the Stanley Cup final, because there is a real argument that this team is the best team in the entire Eastern Conference still.
2 weeks from now, when we have actual hockey to talk about, I'm sure that'll be our starting point of who can actually beat Florida, because the only team in the East that gave them a real challenge was the Rangers, and that was a very Shesterkin-driven challenge. And when you are dependent on a goalie getting you that far, I struggle to see it, man. I don't think anyone in this division is beating them. I don't think the Devils' style would translate particularly well to a playoff series against them, but that's why they play the games. And that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. Next week, we'll tackle the Metro. The week after that, we'll be talking about real NHL hockey. So we will talk to you guys next week. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you are watching over on YouTube, leave us a comment. Let us know the order you think the Atlantic Division teams are going to finish in. We'll talk to you guys next week.